Welcome to part 11 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll create a base character class that will serve as the foundation for our enemies and our player. We'll also implement our first enemy, the spider, setting up its basic structure. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and start building our enemies. Now that we've built the foundation for our player, including movement, input handling, and a state machine, it's time to introduce some challenge to our game by adding enemies. Enemies will bring our world to life, giving the player obstacles to overcome, making the gameplay more engaging. Just like our player, our enemies will have their own unique behaviors, movement patterns, and interactions. In this section, we'll start by creating a simple enemy, implementing movement logic, and gradually expanding their functionality using the same structured approach we use for the player. By the end of the section, we'll have two different enemy types that our player will need to react to in our game. Let's get started by creating our first enemy, the spider. To start, let's make a new file for our spider class. Under our code, under game objects, we'll make a new folder. Let's call this enemies. We'll add a new file, we'll call it spider. And for the time being, I'm going to copy over all of our logic from our player class into our spider class. Let's update our class name, we'll do spider. And let's update our type for our configuration, we'll do spider config. And then we'll update our type down in our constructor. So now for our spider class, this is going to reuse a lot of the same logic that we use in our player class. Our spider will also be an arcade physics sprite, so we'll need things like our spider's position, which animations to use, our asset key. We'll need to enable physics, and since we have our animations, we'll need our animation configuration of what animations to play. Finally, we'll want to use similar components in a state machine so our enemy can move around our scene and have a different behavior type than our player, because we want this to be controlled automatically. So since a lot of this logic will be the same between our two classes and our other enemy that we'll add, it makes sense to abstract away this logic into a parent class that both of these classes will be able to inherit from. So to make that change, let's go into our game objects folder, and so let's add a new subfolder. We're going to call this common. Now under here, we'll make a new file. We'll call this character game object. So let's copy all of our code from our player class into our character game object class. Let's update our class name. And so we're going to do character game object. And now for our character game object class, we want this to be an abstract class, and that way we don't create an instance of this directly. So now for our class, we just need to make this more generic so it's reusable between our two classes. First, we'll start with our properties. We don't want these to be private. Instead, we'll want these to be protected, so then that way we can use these in our child classes. So for each of our properties, let's just add the protected keyword. We'll remove our prefix for private. Then we're just going to add an underscore, just so it's very clear that these are protected properties on our class. Next, in our constructor, instead of doing player config, we're just going to call this character config. Come up here, we'll update our type definition. Next, for our animation configuration, we'll want to pass this in to our constructor since this is going to vary between our game objects. So let's copy this. We'll come up here. Let's add an animation config. We'll add our type for animation config. Let's remove our configuration from here. Now for our components, we need to update our references, and so we'll just change our names to have our underscore. Let's update our reference to our animation config. So this will come from our config argument. Now we need to do our speed. So instead of referencing our player's speed, we'll pass that in as well. So we'll add a new property. We'll do speed. This will be a number. Down here, we'll just reference config.speed. And actually, since we're destructuring our config object here, let's actually grab those from here. So we'll have speed, and then we'll have our animation config. And that way we'll keep our code consistent. Next, let's update our reference for our input component. Instead of doing controls, we're just going to call this input component. We'll also grab that from our config when we destructure it. And let's update our reference here. Now for our state machine, let's update our name, and so we'll have this._state machine. And now we need to provide an ID for our state machine, so we'll add that as a property, and so we'll have ID. We'll make this an optional string, and then we'll pass in our ID if it's provided. So we'll need to grab that from our config object. Now let's remove our update logic here, since we only need that on our player class. So now let's update our getters and our setters, and so we're just going to update all of our references. Then finally in our update method, and we're just going to add the public keyword to our update method. Finally, we just need to update our states to no longer reference our player class. Instead, our type is going to refer to our character game object class. Let's copy our class name. We'll jump over to our idle state. We'll need to go into our base character state to update it here first. And so for our type, let's change this to be character game object. We'll update our constructor. We'll remove our import. So now back in our idle state, we can update our type reference here. And now let's do the same thing in our move state. All right, so if we close our states, let's come back to our character game object class, and we'll just update our imports to remove our unused imports. And let's save. And then one last property we're going to add is we're going to add a property to keep track if this game object instance is actually our player or not. So we're going to add in a protected property, and we'll do isPlayer. We'll make that a Boolean. We'll add that to our configuration, and so we'll do isPlayer. It'll be a Boolean. Now we just want to set that value, so we'll copy isPlayer. Then down at the bottom of our constructor, we're just going to add a spot for general configuration. We'll do this, our isPlayer is equal to isPlayer. Finally, we're just going to add a getter to check to see if this is an enemy, and so we'll do get isEnemy. This will return a Boolean value, and we'll return not this isPlayer. Now that we have our new base class, let's start off by updating our player to make sure our code still works. So if we jump over to our player class, we want to update this to extend our character game object class, and so we'll do extends, we'll do our character game object class. Let's start off, we'll remove our properties, since these will be on our base parent class. So now when we call super, now we need to provide our configuration. And so we're just going to add code down here. We're going to do super. Now for our object, we're going to expect our scene. So let's pass in our scene. We'll grab that from our config.scene. We'll need our position. And so we'll do position. This will be equal to our config.position. And so now for our asset key, instead of passing in our asset key for our player, we're just going to add that here. So let's do our asset keys. We're going to do player. For our frame, we'll do 0. Our ID, let's do player. We'll set isPlayer to be true. We need to pass in our animation config. And then for our speed, we'll do our player speed. And finally, for our input component, we'll do config, and we'll reference our controls. So now for our code to work properly, let's grab our animation config, and we're going to paste that up here before our super call. And then let's remove our code up here. So now let's remove our logic here for our physics and our animation configuration. We can remove our components, since these are added on our parent class. And now for our state machine, we don't need to create our state machine instance, but we do need to do our calls where we add in our various states. And so we'll add in our idle state, we'll add in our move state, and then we'll also set our initial state. Finally, we want to keep our event for doing our auto update call for our class. So now let's get rid of all of our logic here for our getters and our update method. And then finally, let's update our config up here. So we won't need our asset key, we won't need our frame. So now if we come back to our game scene, let's update our references for our player. We'll get rid of our frame and our asset key. All right, if we jump back to our player class, one change we need to make in our base class is we need to remove our lines of code where we set our states for our state machine. All we'll want to do is create our state machine instance, and then we'll rely on the child classes to actually add the states that are appropriate for that game object. All right, so finally, let's clean up our imports that aren't being used. And now if we save our code, let's come over to our browser and we should be able to test. And so now if we move our player around our scene, we should see that our player's animations and our directions are still working just like before. All right, so now that we've verified our base class is working, now let's copy all of our code from our player class over to our spider class, and we'll update our configuration to point to our spider. So for our config, let's do our spider config. We'll update our class name to be spider. And so now for our spider, let's start off with our animation config. For our spider, we'll need to add this into our preload scene. So let's open up that file now. And we need to copy this line of code here from our create animations. And we want to do the same thing we did for our player. So we'll do asset keys, we'll do spider. And so just like our player, we have an asprite file that has all of our defined animations. And we're just going to create those animations from that file. Back in our spider class, for our spider, we only have one animation, and this is going to be our movement animation that we're going to play for both walk and idle. And so to make our config a little bit more simpler, we're just going to make a new variable, do const, we'll do anim config. We're going to set that equal to one of our objects here, so let's copy this. And now for our reference, we want to do our spider animation keys, and we want to do walk. Now we can just update all of our other keys to point to this object here. Next, in our super call, let's update our reference. So for our asset key, we want to use spider. So now for our ID, we're going to have multiple instances of our spider game object. So we don't want to just do spider for our string. Instead, we want to add in a UUID, so it's unique per instance. To do that, we'll just add a suffix to our spider string, and we're just going to reference our phaser, our math, our random, and we'll do a UUID to make this unique per spider instance. So now for isPlayer, we want to set this to be false. Now we need to add a variable for our enemy speed. So if we jump over to our config file, I'm going to copy this line of code here for our player speed. So we're just going to change this to be enemy underscore spider speed. And now for our value, we'll just leave it at 80 for the time being. Let's save. We'll come back to our spider class. Let's update our reference. And now we need to provide our input component. So instead of relying on our controls from our game scene, we're going to create a new instance of our input component, and we'll pass that to our parent class. Now finally for our state machine, we'll have an idle and we'll have a movement state. And we'll want to start off in our idle state. And then finally, let's remove our event listener for we listen for our update event. For all of our enemies, we're going to end up adding these to groups, and we'll let our phaser group later on be responsible for running our update method. So now let's just clean up our unused imports. And now what we should be able to do is if we jump over to our game scene, we should be able to create an instance of our new game object. So after we create our player, let's do new, we'll do a new spider. Now for our configuration, I'm just going to copy our configuration from our player. Let's paste that in. Let's get rid of our controls. And now for our position, we're just going to add 50 to our Y value so it's not on top of our player. And now we just need to fix our configuration. So if we come back to our spider class, let's remove controls from our spider config. So now when we save, if we come back over to our browser, we should see that our new character game object type's been added. And so we have our spider and we're playing our idle animation for our spider. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.